Welcome back to Beyond the Scoreboard. I would like to begin with a question. When the world finally becomes quiet, who will speak? Not your coach, not your parents, not your teammates or teachers or friends or media, not the crowd. You. Eventually, every one of us reaches a moment where there is no applause to encourage us, no criticism to challenge us, and no one left to tell us what to do. Only our own thoughts. And I have often wondered if the most important conversation we will ever have is the one nobody else will ever hear. Because long after every game has ended, long after graduation, long after careers have changed, and long after people have forgotten our successes and our failures, one voice continues to speak, our own. That voice has remarkable power. It tells us who we are, what we deserve, whether we belong, whether we are capable, whether we should keep trying, or whether we should quietly give up. Perhaps that's why the greatest battles we fight are rarely against other people. They're fought within ourselves. What fascinates me is that our inner voice rarely speaks in facts. It speaks in stories. I'm not a leader. I have never been good under pressure. I am just not confident. always disappoint people. I am too old. I'm not talented enough. I miss my opportunity. I'll never be enough. Now listen carefully to those statements. They sound like facts, but are they really? Or are they simply stories that have been repeated so often they have become familiar? There's an important difference. Facts describe reality, and stories interpret reality. And sometimes we confuse the two. Think about an athlete who misses the game winning shot. The fact is simple. They missed a shot. But almost immediately the mind begins writing a story. Not clutch. I always fail when it matters. My teammates can't trust me. The event lasted only a few seconds. The story may last for years. The same thing happens far beyond sport. A student fails an exam. Well, I guess I'm not smart enough. Someone is overlooked for a promotion. They don't see leadership in me. Or maybe a relationship ends. I will never be loved the way I hoped. Or maybe a business fails and you say, I am just not meant for this. The event becomes history, the story becomes identity. That's what makes stories so powerful. Not because they're always true, because they quietly become the lens through which we begin to see ourselves. I have coached athletes with remarkable ability who sincerely believed they were average. No matter how much progress they made, they continued living inside an old story. Every mistake became proof they were not good enough. Every success was dismissed as luck. Nothing I said could immediately change that because the story had become stronger than the evidence. I have also coached athletes whose physical gifts were far more ordinary, yet they carried a very different story. Hey, I can improve. I haven't figured it out yet. This doesn't define me. I'll be better tomorrow. Well, the difference wasn't talent, the difference was interpretation. One athlete saw every setback as confirmation, the other saw every setback as information. The same missed shot, the same difficult season, the same criticism, completely different futures. That has made me wonder whether human beings experience life as it really is, or whether we experience life through the stories we have learned to believe. Perhaps the two people can live through the exact same event and leave carrying completely different lives. Not because life treated them differently, but because they gave different meaning to the experience. If that's true, then perhaps our future is shaped not only by what happens to us, but by the story we continue telling ourselves about what happened. That thought is both unsettling and hopeful. It is unsettling because it means some of the limits we accept may never have been true in the first place. But it is hopeful because stories can be questioned, they can be examined, and sometimes they can be rewritten. Before we talk about changing those stories, however, we first have to ask a more important question: where did they come from? Because very few of us created our inner voice entirely on our own. Someone helped write the first chapters. Maybe a parent, a coach, a teacher, a friend, maybe a stranger, or perhaps a single moment we have never forgotten. And maybe understanding that it is where real growth begins. Not by pretending our stories don't exist, by discovering who has been holding the pen. As I have reflected on this over the years, I have become convinced that very few of the stories we carry about ourselves were written entirely by us. Most of them began long before we realized they were becoming part of our identity. Well, think about a child. A child doesn't arrive in the world believing they are intelligent or unintelligent, confident or insecure, a leader or a follower, successful or unsuccessful. Those ideas are learned, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. One conversation at a time, one experience at a time, or one comment, one disappointment, one success at a time. Sometimes a teacher says, "You have a real gift for this." Those few words stay with a student for years, not because they were magical, because they helped shape the story that student began telling themselves. Sometimes the opposite happens. A careless comment, a public embarrassment, a harsh criticism, a moment of rejection. The event lasts only a few minutes. The story survives for decades. That's the remarkable thing about being human. We often recover from experiences much faster than we recover from the meaning we attach to those experiences. Perhaps that's why two people can live through the same event and carry completely different futures. One athlete is cut from a team, the first quietly concludes and say I wasn't good enough. The second concludes I have more work to do. The event is identical, the future is not. One story closes a door, the other leaves it open. Neither athlete knows what tomorrow will bring, but the story they choose determines how they meet tomorrow. The same thing happens in classrooms. One student receives constructive feedback and hears, "My teacher believes that I can improve," and another hears, "I am disappointing everyone." The words spoken may be exactly the same. The story created is completely different. That's why communication is never just about words. It's about interpretation, and interpretation is deeply personal. Every one of us filters life through experiences that nobody else can fully see. That realization has changed the way I think about coaching. When I was younger, I believed my responsibility was to improve performance. Now I believe my responsibility is much greater. Every conversation I have with an athlete has the potential to become part of the story they tell themselves years from now. That's a sobering responsibility because coaches do not simply develop players. Teachers do not simply educate students. Parents do not simply raise children, or leaders do not simply manage people. Whether we intend to or not, we help shape identity. That doesn't mean we are responsible for every story someone believes. Life is far too complex for that. But it doesn't mean our words matter more than we sometimes realize. Encouragement matters, correction matters, patience matters, honesty matters, and not because one conversation changes everything, but because repeated conversations slowly become beliefs, and beliefs quietly become identity. There is another thought that continues to challenge me. Sometimes the loudest voice in our lives belongs to someone who is no longer speaking. Perhaps it's a coach from 20 years ago, a parent, a teacher, a former teammate, a friend, or perhaps someone who underestimated us. Their words may have lasted only seconds, yet somehow they continue speaking inside our minds years later. That raises a difficult question. How many of the things we believe about ourselves actually belong to someone else? How many limits have we accepted because someone else failed to see our potential? Or how many dreams have you quietly abandoned because one disappointing moment convinced us that it represented our entire future? That's not only true in sport, it's true in leadership, in education, relationships, in careers, even in faith. Sometimes we become prisoners of stories that were never meant to define us. And perhaps one of the greatest acts of wisdom is learning to separate what happened from what it meant. Because those are not always the same thing. Failure happened. That doesn't mean you are a failure. You were rejected. That doesn't mean you are unworthy. You made a mistake. That doesn't mean your identity is your mistake. Those distinctions matter more than we realize. Because human beings rarely live according to facts alone. We live according to the meaning we assign to those facts. Perhaps that's why changing our lives begins long before changing our circumstances. It begins by asking a question that is most simple and incredibly difficult. Is the story I have been telling myself actually true? That question cannot be answered quickly. It requires humility, reflection, honesty, sometimes even forgiveness. But every meaningful change begins there. Because before we can rewrite the future, we must first be willing to examine the story that has been writing us. If everything we have talked about today is true, then another question naturally follows. Can our stories actually change? I think many people immediately answer that question with optimism. Of course they can, but I'm not sure if it is that simple. Because changing a story is not the same as pretending the past never happened. The past cannot be rewritten. The missed opportunity was real. The injury was real. The disappointment was real. The rejection, criticism, and the loss was real. The question is not whether those moments happened. The question is whether those moments deserve to become the final chapter of your identity. There is an important difference between remembering an experience and allowing that experience to define us. One shapes our wisdom, the other limits our future. Perhaps maturity is learning the difference. One of the greatest mistakes we make is believing that the loudest voice is always the truest one. Fear is always loud. Shame, regret, self-doubt. They are all loud. They speak with confidence. They sound convincing. Yet confidence and truth are not the same thing. Sometimes the quietest voice is the most trustworthy. The voice that says, you still have something to learn. You are not finished. This moment is painful, but it is not permanent. You are more than your worst day. That voice rarely shouts. It patiently waits for us to become quiet enough to hear it. Perhaps that's why reflection matters so much. Not because reflection changes the past. Reflection changes our understanding of the past, and understanding changes the future. That's why I believe the role of a coach extends far beyond teaching a sport. A great coach helps an athlete see themselves more truthfully than fear allows. Not by offering empty encouragement, not by pretending weaknesses do not exist, but by refusing to let one mistake become an identity. The same is true of great teachers, of great parents, great mentors, great leaders. Their greatest contribution is often not the knowledge they share. It is the story they help another person discover about themselves. Think about the people who change your life. Perhaps they didn't give you external opportunities. They didn't solve your problems. Perhaps what they really gave you was something much more valuable, a different way of seeing yourself. Sometimes one person believes in us before we are able to believe in ourselves. And sometimes one sentence changes the direction of a life. Not because it changes reality, because it changes the story through which reality is understood. That realization has changed the way I think about leadership. Leadership is not about helping people become someone they are not. Leadership is helping people see more clearly who they are and what they are capable of becoming. That's a profound difference. One creates dependence, the other creates freedom. Perhaps that's also why faith always spoken so deeply to human identity. Throughout scripture, we see ordinary people who often misunderstood themselves. A shepherd who doubted he could lead, a fisherman who doubted his courage, a persecutor who never imagined he would become a servant. Again and again, the transformation didn't begin because their past disappeared. It began because they came to understand themselves differently in light of God's purpose. Their circumstances did not immediately change, their identity did. And from that new understanding, their lives slowly followed. Maybe that is true for us as well. Maybe growth is not becoming someone completely different. Maybe growth is allowing truth to replace the stories fear has been telling us for years. That takes time, it takes honesty, it takes humility, and sometimes it takes another person who is willing to remind us of who we are when we have forgotten. As we close today's episode, I want to leave you with one final question. If someone could listen to every conversation you have with yourself for the next 24 hours, what story would they hear? Would they hear hope or resignation? Would they hear courage or fear? Would they hear possibility or limitation? Would they hear truth or simply repetition? Because the voice that shapes your life most is rarely the loudest voice around you. It is the quiet voice within you. And perhaps the goal is not to invent a better story. Perhaps the goal is to discover a truer one. One that is shaped by growth instead of fear, by purpose instead of regret, by hope instead of pain. Because eventually, every one of us lives according to the story we believe is true. So choose that story carefully, question it honestly, refine it continually, and never allow your worst moment to become your permanent identity. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Beyond the Scoreboard. Until next time, remember that some of the most important victories in life are won long before anyone else sees them. They are won in quiet conversation we have with ourselves. Because beyond every scoreboard, there is a story, and that story is quietly becoming your life.